we have put together a terrific panel of guests to help us think about partition, which happened 100 years ago, or the birth of Northern Ireland, which happened 100 years ago. And that in itself is a very interesting starting point for our conversation, because like with so many things in Northern Ireland, we often disagree about how to even describe moments in history. So for the Unionist population in Northern Ireland, this centenary of the birth of Northern Ireland is a very significant moment. And for many within the Loyalist and Unionist community, it's a very celebratory moment about the creation of the state of Northern Ireland. But for many others within the Republican and Nationalist community, it's not the centenary of the birth of Northern Ireland so much as the 100th anniversary of the imposition of partition, the division of the island of Ireland, that is remembered and commemorated this year. So with that introduction, I want to explore where we are in this centenary year and where we might be going in this society, and how religion, and by religion I mean overwhelmingly the Christian churches in a place such as Northern Ireland, are implicated in all of those questions and journeys. So joining us to make sense of it all is Father Martin Magill, parish priest of St. John the Evangelist on the Falls Road in Belfast. Tim Cairns, who's a former special advisor to the DUP. He's got a number of formers, actually. Former barrister, former pastor, trained at Regent College, Vancouver, and worked as a pastor for some years in Canada as well. Dr. Gladys Ganiel, research fellow in the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace at Queen's University, author who specializes in the Northern Ireland conflict, evangelicalism and Christianity in Northern Ireland. And I'm hoping we will soon be joined by Dr. Eamon Phoenix. Are you with us, Eamon?
I'm with you indeed. Yes.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Otherwise, you would have missed your introduction. Political historian and an advisor to the Taoiseach special panel on these centenary commemorations, because we've had a number of them, as you can imagine, in the last few years. So welcome to all of you. We're going to talk for a moment about the past, the present, and the future in Northern Ireland, and then we'll welcome some of your responses, questions for our panel of guests and experts. Eamon, let me come to you first. Let's talk first about centenary and partition and what that means. Can you describe for us, very briefly, in a few brisk sentences, I warn you as a political historian not to give us your full book-length version of this. Can you remind us how partition came about?
Yes, indeed. Very briefly, of course. Home rule had been opposed by the Unionists of the north of Ireland from the late 19th century. Things reached crisis point in 1912-14. A Home Rule Bill was being tabled by a Liberal government supported by Irish nationalists. It was guaranteed to pass because the House of Lords veto had been removed. And you had massive Unionist extra-parliamentary resistance backed by the Conservative Party, who feared that a self-governing Ireland would end the empire. Things reached almost the point of civil war by 1914. No compromise was in sight. Then the Great War supervened, diverting the two rival armies which had been formed in Ireland, Carson's Ulster Volunteers, Redmond's Irish Volunteers, largely to the Western Front. Things are complicated by a rising during the war by a minority of Irish Republicans. They take over Dublin. The leaders are executed. Public opinion in nationalist Ireland changes. By the end of the war, really, Ireland's once more on the brink. The Ulster Unionists reinforced in the north were demanding exclusion from a self-governing Ireland, whether home rule or republic. Nationalist Ireland is largely in favour of absolute independence. A war of independence begins. An alternative government is set up by Dáil Éireann, and this eventually gives really the British government an opportunity, because Ireland had always, partition had always been blocked by Irish nationalists, 80 or so strong at Westminster. Now Sinn Féin was abstaining. The largest Irish party were led by Edward Carson, the Ulster Unionists. They were acquiescent, of course, in partition, and therefore the Government of Ireland Act was passed. The partition scheme was shaped largely by Ulster Unionists. It now involves a parliament in Belfast because self-determination is the name of the post-war world. Sinn Féin reject this. The Northern nationalist community still heart after Irish unity. And of course, there's massive sectarian violence in Belfast in these years and elsewhere. And finally, when partition occurs, it's very much a settlement shaped by Craig, Carson and the Ulster Unionists, based on a Protestant Ulster Special Constabulary. The nationalists opposed partition. They looked to Dublin to undo it. but the best they get is a promise to revise the borders, which eventually collapses. And you have the nationalists, or a state within a state in Northern Ireland from 1922, looking to Dublin with their own culture, religion, schools. The Unionists are very much shaping a Protestant Unionist state. And that is the clock ticking down to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement.
Goodness, well, that's about 80 years of Irish history in, I think, about 2 minutes. Thank you for that. Eamon, if anybody could manage that, it is you. Let's talk about the 6-county state that emerged from the partition period, that is the state of Northern Ireland. It's sometimes called Ulster, but of course, traditionally, the province of Ulster has 9 counties. How did Northern Ireland get 6 counties?
That's a very good question. And in fact, the Long Committee, chaired by a British minister called Walter Long, which drew up the Government of Ireland scheme, it actually proposed 2 Irish parliaments, but they only ever expected the one in the north, which had majority consent there, to run. Craig was offered 9 counties, the historic province, the province of the Covenant, which still had a Protestant majority, but only about 54%. Craig rejected it. In fact, we have his input to the Long Committee in which he said, quote, Protestant representation would be strengthened and 6 counties would be a unit easier to govern. So here you'll have what the Nationalists always talked about, Northern Ireland based on a sectarian head count. 6 counties instead of the historic 9. But Craig reckoned this would be really partition and unionist rule in perpetuity, something that obviously is being challenged now by demographic changes and Brexit.
So in effect, we can really talk about 2 partitions, the partition of Ireland and the partition of the province of Ulster.
And the Protestants of the 3 lost counties, as they were known, Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, there were 25% of the population in Monaghan, 20% in Donegal. They had been part of the Orange Order, part of the Ulster Volunteer Force, had run guns from Larne against Home Rule. They felt very much excluded and abandoned. And in fact, they believed that Carson, a Southern Unionist himself, had abandoned them pragmatically to preserve a more, if you like, long-lasting Unionist unit.
Eamon, where were the main churches of Northern Ireland today? The Catholic, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, the Anglican, that is the Church of Ireland. Where were they in all of these decisions 100 years ago?
The churches had a lot more pulling power then, a lot more traction. It's fair to say they aligned themselves largely with their community blocks. And that means until the 1960s, there was very little interchurch activity at all, until the Troubles really in 1969. So the upshot was that the Protestant churches backed the Covenant. It was signed after Carson and Craig, the Unionist leaders, by the Church of Ireland Primate, the Presbyterian Moderator and the rest. And of course, the Covenant, which threatened to oppose Home Rule by force if necessary, by armed force, was signed in church halls throughout the province of Ulster. And the Catholic Church generally gave support to Home Rule. Parish priests, even bishops, were members of the various Home Rule organisations from Parnell's day onwards, something of course, affrighted Unionism because they believed that Home Rule would be Home Rule. A problem came in 1916 when nationalist Ireland swung towards independence and a movement that was prepared to use violence on the Republican side. And the Catholic Church divided on that. Very much Cardinal Logue and the hierarchy very much condemned IRA violence during the War of Independence while condemning the violence of security forces as well. And this continues. But when the treaty is finally signed, which really endorses partition and an Irish dominion in 26 counties of the south, the Irish hierarchy issue a statement in 1921 saying, this peace is God's gift. But there had been this alignment, and that alignment would continue on both sides of the new Irish border. The Catholic Church very much calling the tune in independent Ireland after 1922, shaping social policy, morality, the laws, consulted by Eamon de Valera, and bringing down a government in 1951 over a mother and child scheme. In the north, the Protestant churches working with the Orange Order would undo Lord Londonderry's for integrated education, which were very, very futuristic for that time. But they were undermined really by this alliance, which Craig eventually took on board and made concessions. And we had in Northern Ireland from 1925 the endowment of Protestantism by the state, because unlike in other parts of these islands, state schools in Northern Ireland were effectively Protestant schools, which were shaped to suit the Protestant churches, which had handed those schools over. The Catholic Church was outside the state, got no funds in the 20s, got lower funds after that, and you had a grievance from the beginning.
Eamon, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. And though the island was partitioned, and though Ulster as a province was partitioned, as Eamon has explained, What wasn't partitioned was the polity of the four main churches in Northern Ireland, who have all remained all island churches: the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the Methodist, the Catholic, and the Anglican. Tim, what does partition mean to you? What does the centenary year of 2021 mean to you?
Well, obviously, I think for anyone, I think you've got to say that the partition meant that something went wrong. I think for most people, we would really rather the island of Ireland had stayed as one unit within the United Kingdom. I mean, it was interesting really listening to Eamon there. I mean, my grandmother was from Cavan and was sent up as a young girl to Northern Ireland to go and live with an aunt, because her father couldn't countenance the two girls of the family growing up in the Irish Free State. I'm not sure what he thought was going to happen, but they were sent to Donegal, and she was a pretty interesting woman. Became a Free Presbyterian and a founding member of the DUP. And for her prayer was that she thanked God that every day he took her out of the Irish Free State. So I mean, there's plenty of comedy stories about my granny. She would go around the supermarkets, believe it or not, looking at the back of products to see whether they were produced, and anything that was produced in the Republic of Ireland, she wouldn't buy it. So, so I mean, I think that she was of that generation, and for her, even looking back, the whole idea of partition to her was horrific. That Ireland should have stayed as one, and Ireland should have stayed within the United Kingdom. So I think certainly looking back to the past, certainly the stories that I would have heard were stories of great suspicion about the Republic of Ireland, great suspicion about what the Catholic Church was up to, and Eamon touched on that in his whistle stop tour of some of what the Catholic Church was up to. And I think certainly if you look back to the past, those were certainly the stories that I would have grown up with and hearing from my granny. Now, if we want to take it then through to today and 100 years later, I think we see a very different Northern Ireland, and we see a very different Republic of Ireland, and we see a very different, we see a more secular society emerging, both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And I think, where's that going to take us through the next 100 years? But I think anybody has to look back with it, certainly with tinged with some sadness, that that we're in the situation that we're in. And I think what we're disagreeing over is constitutional control. And obviously for Unionists, we want to see constitutional control remain within the United Kingdom. And nationalists in 1916 and before, up to today, want to see constitutional control on the island of Ireland. And obviously, I think it's until we get that resolved in some way, there's always going to be these tensions and these issues.
Father Martin, how do you feel about what happened 100 years ago, and how do you look at the concept in your mind of partition?
I think for me, probably, William, it's been a changing one. So certainly growing up, I grew up in a family where my dad would have been very staunchly for a free state, burn everything British, only coal type of attitude, gives some idea. And I suppose a real sense of, really right throughout my whole life, I've been praying, when I'm praying for the country, I'm praying for 32 counties rather than for 6 counties. That's probably where I was. I suppose in some ways I reluctantly come into this whole discussion. I think in the past I sort of was almost going to ignore the fact that we have this 100 years. But I suppose a number of different things, various invitations to think about it, contribute to it. I suppose I grew up very strongly anti-partition. That would have been, I suppose, very much my background. But I suppose with some of the work that I've been involved in, and especially over the last, around the last 10 years or so, we've had this decade of centenaries where we've looked at events which could very easily have derailed our peace process. And yet through the likes of contributions such as Eamon's, we've managed to negotiate those, I think, in a very skillful and indeed ethical way. So I'm now at the stage of really turning more really to the likes of the historians, and I'm really glad that we were making sure that Eamon was part of this conversation right from the start, because in many ways, to be able to look to history, to look at the facts as much as we possibly can, is a very useful way of approaching this. It's also very useful hearing the likes of the stories that Tim has just been sharing there. And I think that whole sense of, as we move into this, that we find respectful ways of acknowledging, we can't airbrush out our history, but that we find ways to be able to actually hear and learn from it, and to find common ground.
Gladys Ganiel, so much has changed in the past 100 years. For example, 100 years ago, Belfast was the industrial hub of this island. That's a massive transformation. So much has changed in terms of the politics, the culture, and the religion story. Can you sketch out the most important changes as you see them in the past 100 years?
I suppose in terms of religion, the big story is secularization. So Eamon described a situation where the churches had a lot of political influence and social power at the time of partition and then in the decades following. But the huge story has really been secularization, particularly since the 1960s. Although I say that with a caveat, because as we know, the Troubles started in the late 1960s. And most sociologists of religion would say that the Troubles, I suppose, artificially inflated religiosity for much of the 30 years of the Troubles. So going to church was a way to identify with your community. And of course, we also know that religion is, in some senses, a coping mechanism, and being exposed to so much trauma also encouraged people to continue to identify with religion. So the rest of Europe was undergoing a rapid process of secularization since the 1960s due to the wider macro processes of economic development and modernization and so forth. So it's slower on the island of Ireland, both north and south, secularization. But what's really interesting is from the late 1990s, you get very steep declines, both north and south. So the dynamics are related. But again, some people would say, the ending of the Troubles, so-called in 1998, with the Belfast Agreement, was a real spur to quickening the pace of secularization, I suppose. And there are three main ways that sociologists would measure secularization. So whether people identify with religion, declines in worship, attendance at worship service, and then also declines in social and political influence. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the decline, in 1968, 95% of Catholics in Northern Ireland went to Mass every week. By 2019, 46% of Catholics go to Mass monthly. And so actually 46% is a really high figure compared to the rest of Europe, but it's much lower, than 95%. And in 1968, Protestants, 45% went weekly. By 2019, about 46% are still going, but this is only monthly now. So there has been a drop off in attendance in both those. And in terms of religious identification, it has fallen to the extent that at the start of the 60s, less than 1% of people said they had no religion. And now that's up to 20% with no religion.
Right. And there have been so many different changes in terms of the internet coming along, international travel, television, or other terrestrial forms of communication feels much, in my childhood here, quite an isolated place in terms of global politics and conversation. Certainly not that anymore. Gladys, what do you make of the perception that some people might have looking in on the society of Northern Ireland, that it is a puritanical or deeply conservative place in terms of moral and religious themes?
Well, I think it is, compared to other Western democracies, it is still quite, I don't know if puritanical is the right word, but more conservative. So for instance, if you look at the ongoing, I suppose, controversy around the introduction of abortion legislation in Northern Ireland, and also the way LGBTQ plus people are spoken about and legislation here is handled around some of those so-called moral issues. It certainly is more conservative than other parts. But again, is that the politicians or the people? Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. That's what's happening at the political level. But when you look at the surveys of the population, there are actually much more liberal attitudes, but that's not reflected amongst the politicians themselves. And even like the identification of nationalist and unionist, that is dropping in the population as well. So now a majority of people do not identify, well, not a majority, the largest number of people don't identify as nationalists or unionists. They choose neither. So it's about 39% say they're neither, and the rest split between nationalists and unionists. So there's a swathe of the population that isn't necessarily represented by a nationalist or unionist party, if you want to think in those terms, with the way the system's structured. There's little room for their voices, I think.
And Gladys, is there a connection between the religiously unaligned, which is a fast-growing section of the Northern Irish population, is there a connection between that grouping and the politically unaligned?
Well, there's only 20% who say no religion. And we know that probably a majority of those come from Protestant backgrounds. So it's really quite hard to tease this out, you know, given that 39% are saying neither. We can't really just say it's unaffiliated Protestants, as it were. So I don't think you can definitively judge that and say no religion is unaligned politically. It's a bit more complicated than that.
And so when we look at the language of Protestantism or references to Catholics, you heard a lot of that in the 1970s and into the 1980s. That's what people across the world heard as the grammar of the political dispute in Northern Ireland. Tim Cairns, that has changed dramatically. That has changed dramatically here.
Yeah, well, I think there's certainly a huge misunderstanding. I think internationally, people would talk about it being a religious dispute in Northern Ireland, and I think it's a constitutional dispute in Northern Ireland. I think, you know, Gladys has outlined how it's much more become a constitutional dispute than a religious dispute. It's not Protestants fighting Catholics. I think in that sense, it's a constitutional dichotomy of where you want to be governed. I mean, I lived in Canada for a number of years, 9 years, and I think anybody interacted with there, if they knew anything of Northern Ireland, which discovering that very few people know anything about Northern Ireland, is quite an eye-opener when you go somewhere like Canada. I mean, even for people to say, where are you from? The identity question for somebody like me in Canada was a hugely difficult question to answer. So I would say I was Northern Irish. Well, people would have no idea what that was. They would say, so you're Irish? We say, well, no, I'm not Irish, I'm British. But you said you were Northern Irish. So I used to just give up in the end and just say I was Irish because it made it a lot easier. Maybe shouldn't have said that if this had been recorded and put on YouTube. But it was certainly a lot easier because that identity question. Because even if people did know about Northern Ireland, they thought it was a religious dispute, that it was something, a hang up from the Williamite conquest of of 1690, that it was something, it was a hang up of that. And yes, it is rooted in that, of course it is. But that's not what the question was anymore. The question wasn't a religious question, it was a constitutional question.
And I think, Eamon, let's bring you in on this and get your sense of the current mix. I think there's a popular misunderstanding of the society of Northern Ireland, because this is, and I've lived here all my life, is an increasingly progressive, liberalizing, more secular society that many people outside of Northern Ireland appreciate.
No, I'd agree with some of the previous speakers. Gladys there saying that the parties don't quite reflect the diversity of the community. And a lot of people don't vote, of course. And you have had this Alliance Green surge in the last couple of elections, showing that a lot of younger people who are more and more remote, as they are in the Republic, from partition and from the events of the 20s, are really, taking a very different line, a more inclusive approach to the problem. Many of them were pro-European. That was more important to them perhaps than an Irish or British identity, and we're aware of that. So yes, indeed, I mean, people think it's orange and green. They read, the decennial reports, which will be coming up soon, that the number of peace lines have doubled, which indeed they have. Or they'll read something that's probably still true, that 90% of people in Northern live in areas that are overwhelmingly Protestant or Catholic, which is probably still a factor. But there are a lot of people of a certain age very often who have the experience of life behind them, and whose views have softened in the interim. Young people coming up and so on, who have a different view and who are, making their presence felt politically in the last half decade or so.
And though in the past we had a majority and a minority split in looking at some of these issues, I think many people are expecting that when we get the results of the most recent census, there will be no single majority community in Northern Ireland. In fact, we might have 3 communities in terms of a nationalist or unionist and other or politically unaligned. And that third community may be the one that is most consequential when it comes to possible issues around border polls and issues about the future of the island itself, whether there is to be reunity and the like. So those are some of the complexities of the history and how they contribute to our society as it exists right now. I want to bring up another word and ask Tim Cairns to analyze how this has affected where we are right now, Brexit.
Yeah, I think Brexit has certainly brought divisions more to the fore. Just to pick up on what Eamon was saying there, I do think there is actually a dichotomy even within this Brexit debate and what we're seeing playing out in the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. I think that you can't divorce discussing where Northern Ireland's at right now and divorce that from class. Yep. And I think there is a huge class difference. I mean, yes, I think we see younger people who might be trying to plot different courses than their parents within the middle classes. But I think it's undeniable that since 1998, Northern Ireland's become a much more sectarian society amongst the working class, particularly within working class loyalism. I think, and I think we see this even on TikTok, where you're seeing a much more sectarian nationalist Republican, and those are younger people. Those are people who have not been born during the Troubles. And I think it's important, to look at that and to see why that is. Why are there these people who are, know nothing of the Troubles, and why are they more sectarian in their views than even their parents were? So I think we can't say that Northern Ireland's just some utopia now where sectarianism is disappearing and young people want a new way that includes new social structures and all that. Yeah. Because I don't think that's right. But I do think Brexit has really brought that to the fore. And I think particularly within unionist, loyalist communities over the last few months, we've seen that in particular, that Brexit has really brought that unionist loyalist identity more to the fore, because it feels like something is being lost. It feels like something is being diminished in the Brexit debate, and that something has been given away by the British government, particularly at the behest, not the bidding of the Irish government. Now whether those are right, those views, that is the feeling. Whether and that's the view that the people hold. Whether they're right in that or whether they're not, that's how communities are feeling. I think we see a sense of very much a bubbling undercurrent, particularly within loyalist communities, that there's deep dissatisfaction with the way things are going, certainly deep dissatisfaction with the way the peace process has gone, and Brexit really highlights that.
And also within the nationalist Republican communities, Martin, you have a sense with Brexit, a feeling that something was taken away, the European aspect of life in Northern Ireland, even though Northern Ireland voted by majority for Remain.
Oh, very much so. And I suppose actually in many ways that's been used to further the discussions around the need for a border poll. And I suppose that whole sense of, and Tim, I think, mentions there, or someone certainly mentioned about the idea of younger people, identifying more as pro-European. And I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. I suppose one of the things, if I might go back a little bit, just on Tim's point, I'm glad he brings up the question of class, though I wouldn't actually agree with his point about it's becoming more sectarian. I suppose I was keen that in this discussion as well, that, the whole question of how much has our peace process benefited those who are in working class areas. And I think there's sections of right throughout Northern Ireland where in many ways they haven't seen that peace dividend. I wouldn't be going down the line of the working class become more sectarian. I certainly, in terms of some of the younger people, no doubt that certainly some, but I certainly get the sense that a lot of younger people are much more open-minded, and for them sectarianism is dying.
Yeah. Gladys, do we have any metrics on sectarianism whereby we can objectively answer this question?
Well, nothing is springing to mind, I think, in the sense that you're thinking, but I do have some metrics I think that will make the division, I think, over Brexit seem a bit more clear for people. So we know Northern Ireland overall voted to remain at 56%. But there's a huge gap between nationalists and unionists in this. So this helps explain some of the polarization about Brexit, which may look like more sectarianism over this kind of political dispute over Brexit. So people who identified as nationalists, 88% voted to remain, whereas only 34% who identify as unionists voted to remain. So basically 66% of unionists wanted to leave, 12% of nationalists wanted to leave. So there's a huge community divide over the issue of Brexit, even before we get to the whole last, what has been 4 years of things about hard border polls and betrayals and et cetera, et cetera. And the tension, I suppose, around a united Ireland as a result of Brexit has been huge. So again, there's some data from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. In 2016, 18% of unionists thought Brexit would make a united Ireland more likely. By 2018, that had gone up to 28%. And for nationalists in 2016, 38% of nationalists thought Brexit made a united Ireland more likely. By 2018, it was 64%. So this Brexit has brought that old political dispute back to the fore, really. And when we have that, couple that with all the segregation in our communities that we've already spoken about, and then also transgenerational trauma as a result of the Troubles, it's really almost a perfect storm of polarization.
Yeah. I wonder, in this story that we've been telling from partition to Brexit and beyond, I wonder how we can best characterize the contribution of church leaders, of church figures of the mainstream or the larger churches in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. Eamon, how would you try to characterize that?
Saying that they were really propelled into action, William, the church leaders by 1969, biggest population movement in Western Europe, driven by violence and the threat of violence. Suddenly you had Cardinal Conway, the Presbyterian moderator, Archbishop Sims of the Church of Ireland on television together, something people had been very unused to. And after that became normal for governments, even the old Stormont government before it fell in 72, certainly the NIO and its ministers, to consult the church leaders on everything. Now, they didn't agree on an awful lot, but they did want to end violence. They did condemn in unison particular atrocities and so on, and try to come out with a Christian message and so on. Indeed, the government used the churches, and particularly the Catholic Church, to funnel finance from central government to prevent it falling into the hands of the IRA in places like West Belfast, right up to the Good Friday Agreement. But since then, the churches, of course, have been declining, as Gladys has pointed out. And they've lost that plot. I find now, you very rarely have a meeting between the Secretary of State and the church leaders. It's very rare indeed, and usually at the request of the church leaders. A lot has been done, I suppose, on the ground between particular churches. They have had ecumenical forums that have community contact schemes. They've tried to do things, not exclusively in middle-class areas, but probably more in middle-class areas than working. And I'm coming back to the problem I'm aware of that Tim pointed out. I would do a lot of cross-community work, bringing cross-community groups, and indeed groups from the like of Carrickfergus and East Belfast to Dublin, for example, to Dublin Castle, Kilmainham Jail, places perhaps they've never crossed the border, many of these people in their lives. And what I'm aware of is, you look at Titanic Quarter today, there's a film industry there. There is a huge potential for cultural tourism, which has been interrupted by the pandemic. But of course, the shipyard is long gone. And that shipyard community, which built ships and of course created a factory, an industry employing 35,000 people at its height 100 years ago, is now gone. And these people are into fourth generation unemployment. They're generally disregarded by their own kind of political parties. Nobody pays much attention to these people who are really on the margins now. And they see a society transformed by welfarism, by the fact that, Catholics in particular took advantage of free universal education in 1947. And the Catholic schools and the Catholic religious orders pushed their kids on to degree level and university. And that's transformed society here from civil rights to the new Catholic middle class today at every level. But these people are kind of stuck there in that almost Edwardian time frame. And no one is really doing anything for them. And that is a major issue. It does exist to some extent on the Catholic side as well, but it's very, very marked among the unemployed young Protestant male, which is a universal problem today.
It is.
It needs to be addressed by everyone, every party at Stormont, because it contains great dangers.
Tim, Cairns, let me ask you this question again with Eamon's points taken into consideration, because there are some people who say this. That when you look at all these issues facing this society today, the political ones, the constitutional ones, cultural, whether it's abortion, same-sex marriage, or those class issues we've just been hearing about there, we may hear from individual Christian campaign groups like Evangelical Alliance or the Iona Institute or others, but church leaders and the mainstream churches, the largest churches, are AWOL. That is the criticism some make. What do you make of that criticism?
I think it's probably a fair criticism. We don't see the church speaking into social and societal issues in the way that they should do. But I think if you take Protestantism, I think there's almost a difficulty because there's basically a subset of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, that had a much bigger voice, a much bigger influence than what the actual size of the adherents to fundamentalism were in Northern Ireland. I mean, I'm talking about Ian Paisley, the Free Presbyterian Church,
yeah.
and even today the DUP is still dominated by that fundamentalist sect within evangelicalism, and it's had a much bigger voice. And I think for Protestants, and particularly Protestant clergy, and for Protestant church leaders, I think there's been a problem for them in that they don't want to be seen casting that brush. But it's very difficult for them to speak because then the fundamentalists who think, that their view of the Bible, the literal view of the Bible that they take is the purest view of the Bible. And I think then that it leaves church leaders very vulnerable to attack. It leaves them very open to attack where they're seen as maybe going against the purity of what Scripture says. And I think there's a fear within church leaders that if they speak up, because we've seen this, we've seen this throughout the last 20, 30, 40 years, where church leaders have spoken up, and that fundamentalist viewpoint shouts them down and shouts them down from a position where they're not prepared to debate what these issues may mean. And I think that's put a fear within the church to speak out, particularly on social issues. I think for churches to come forward with a more nuanced position on things like same-sex marriage is certainly something that's very difficult. I think for churches to come forward on a more nuanced position in terms of how to break down societal barriers, I think it's become more difficult because they haven't been given that voice. So I think what the church leaders of the main churches need to do is just strike out, because and just have the courage to speak and have the courage to put forward the view, the courage of their convictions, to put forward a different view and speak into the public square. I think we see that, I mean, you've identified it quite rightly there, William. I think a lot of the Protestant, particularly evangelical churches, have just left it to the Evangelical Alliance, have left it to CARE in Northern Ireland to bring forward these issues and to speak into the public square. And I think it's past since time when the Presbyterian Church and the Church of Ireland should actually be getting their voice back.
And it's not to say, Father Martin, that you don't get any contribution, but it's often a press release. And then when we contact church leaders to stand up their press release and come onto programs and be interviewed, we often get a no, and you're left with press releases. Is there a fear within the Catholic leadership to engage on many of the issues we've been talking about, Martin?
Good question. And I suppose actually, and I think Tim has outlined that very well from the Protestant side of things. So there certainly would be plenty of press releases. There certainly is a desire to contribute to the debate. I mean, Eamon Martin, for example, has been Eamon, who's Archbishop of Armagh, has regularly contributed to various issues. I suppose there's also the whole question of if we take your.
But if you don't do an interview, if you won't be interviewed or take part in discussions, your press release isn't. It isn't Martin joining the debate. It's sort of annotating the debate, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was going to say is I think part of the difficulty for the Catholic side of things, because we're such a complex organization, we're breaking into diocese and who actually is speaking. I suppose that's where
you should try being a Protestant.
Well, okay, all right. So, and I take your point. I mean, I suppose, yes. And I mean, to go back to the point about the church leaders, I suppose the reality is they don't agree on some of these social issues. So it's very difficult for them to get a common voice. I suppose, yes, I mean, in terms of the Catholic side of things, yes, we probably do need people prepared to actually go and speak. I suppose, as you probably are aware from the likes of your program, we have to be mandated or to, almost like, that someone would be there to represent the church as such. And there's probably a challenge for us to look at that, to get someone to do that.
You mentioned that program, and I almost want to give out the phone number just out of habit. Can I ask you all, and this is a question that's coming from some of our friends, journalists listening to this, particularly from England and other places, what irritates you about the reporting on religion, culture, politics from outside this place? What irritates you? What can be changed? Now, how can it be done better? Gladys, first of all.
Was it okay, William, if I just go back to something the others were saying?
Oh my goodness!
No, I want to make a point about I
am coming back to my question though.
The church leaders, and that I think when Eamon was speaking about during the Troubles, they were seen together for the first time. Yes, this was significant, but I think that had a very limited impact because it happened out there and people weren't paying attention. And then when Tim was talking about the church leaders aren't saying anything, and they're actually, I think behind the scenes, there is stuff happening, but people aren't seeing it. And even just recently, St. Patrick's Day, the Church Leaders Group, which is the Church of Ireland and Catholic Archbishops of Armagh, the Presbyterian Moderator, Methodist President, and President Irish Council of Churches, had this sort of St. Patrick's method that they linked to the 100th anniversary of Northern Ireland, basically, in the decade of centenaries. And within that statement, there was actually a little confession down in it where they said that, you know, what we did as churches was idolatry. We worshipped the state, basically. And it was almost an apology. It was a confession, really, in some ways. And that was united. And it was probably, I think, the most significant apology type thing I've seen from the church leaders. But the problem is, like, people didn't really probably notice that, you know.
Most people didn't notice it. No, because because when you then ask them to voice it up and be interviewed about it, you've got to know.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that kind of illustrates both.
Not
points.
all of them, incidentally. Not all. I'm generalizing, obviously.
But it's also worth pointing out, though, in the last 10 years, facilitated through the Irish Council of Churches, there has been more probably ecumenical high-level leadership interaction than there's been at any other point in the history of that church body, which is, again, as it's approaching its 100th year anniversary. And they've been working together on Brexit issues, on pandemic-related issues, and on dealing with the past. But given the loss of societal influence, it's not noticed really anymore.
As you look at the history of all of our reporting, though, Gladys, from outside of Northern Ireland, I'm dragging you back to this point. It is an important question in itself. How can people who are reporting on religion and reporting on the cultural and political issues here from outside of Northern Ireland, how can they do better?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably been an overemphasis on going to leadership and not even, and also not including the voices of women in that, you know, women, female church leaders and so forth. I think that's very rarely represented. I mean, across the board in the coverage of religion everywhere, but especially in Northern Ireland, I'd say.
Yeah, well, I agree with Gladys, and I think that's a problem within religion in Northern Ireland that we need to sort out, that we don't have very representative voices. I mean, there's still women, are the female voice is stymied, which is incredible, and there would still be, I can only speak on the Protestant side of things, you know, there'd still be a sizable number of churches that would be uncomfortable with women leadership, and I think we in the church need to start challenging our own house first. You know, take the speck out of our own eye before we remove the plank from the English journalist side, perhaps. We need to, you know, really challenge that, and really, you know, challenge that where the authentic voices of Christianity are. But I think in terms of, you know, outside looking in, it's very reductive almost. You know, Protestantism is seen as this homogenous body. Catholicism, I mean, Martin's already highlighted that, you know, Catholicism's not, you know, a homogenous body. There are different thoughts and different thinkings and different emphasis, and I think that's the same for Protestantism as well. It's not one homogenous group who think one single thing, so it's about delving into those different voices within the different churches and seeing what's being said, because you know, I think people would be quite surprised at what's been said. Certainly in, you know, the church I go to, you know, be very different than you know, the church I grew up in. And I think, you know, there are voices out there that are saying some things are really at the center of where Christianity is globally in Northern Ireland, and we just don't hear those voices, and we don't even hear them locally either. So we need to do a better job, and I would call on journalists from wherever to do a good job on that as well. So
the story is more complicated, and we should avoid stereotyping, and that's true of reporting issues around the world, no different here. Father Martin, what advice would you give journalists outside of this place?
Well, just to pick up something you've said here, story more complicated. My particular one is around the question of education. And when it comes to education, lo and behold, with the question of integrated education as the way forward, almost as the solution. And the number of times that, for me, there's been such a focus on that. I think I want to hear more of actually looking at some of the works. So I know the maintained sector best of all. I'm heading off in a few minutes' time to.
We should explain to other people what that means, the maintained sector.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So the maintained sector would be with really Catholic schools set up to provide education, Catholic education, but open to everyone. But in particular, just to acknowledge the work. I mean, some of the social issues, the tremendous difference that's actually made. Eamon touched on the question of education earlier, the whole thing of being able to break poverty, the whole, and so many of the social issues, the mental health issues, whatever it might be, and that's not recognized. Tackling also sectarianism in the classroom as well, etc. I mean, some of the reporting sometimes has got such a narrow focus with a sense of, okay, integrated education is the way forward. I'm suggesting it needs to be much broader. So, and to go back to your words, it's much more complex.
Though I suspect a lot of people outside of Northern Ireland will find it astonishing in 2021 that we still have a religiously separated, if not segregated, educational system.
Well, that surprises me, William, because I mean, if I take it on a global level, there's no issues in other parts of the world where there's Catholic education. I mean, it's not as if we have Catholic education that's something unique here to Northern Ireland. It's not. It's found all over the world. It's appreciated all over the world. So that surprises me.
Let me say to the others listening in, if you want to join our Zoom and ask a question, I'm going to bring Ruth in a second. We'll give you a chance to do that, or ask questions. You can type them in and put them up. I'm already incorporating some of them as we go. Let me go around the houses though before we do that and ask each of you where you think Northern Ireland will be in 10 years' time. How you think the society's journey of change and transformation is likely to play out. Eamon, first of all, where do you think we'll be?
I think demographic change is obviously going to be charted over the next decade, 2 or 3. I mean, I think it'll be quite fast. That doesn't necessarily mean that people from a Catholic background will be voting overwhelmingly for a united Ireland, but it certainly means that there'll be a greater possibility of cooperation, north-south, and all kinds of things. And if this had been happening in a pre-Brexit situation, one would have expected greater convergence between the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Dáil on, all sorts of cross-border economic and educational and social projects. But I think there will be pressure for that, certainly. I think a lot will depend on what happens to two big blocs. I mean, Sinn Féin and the DUP. I mean, they have both been rocked by different things. The DUP at the moment is speaking with many voices. Sinn Féin, of course, hasn't managed to grow beyond its kind of 38-40% kind of the vote. So there's all sorts of possibilities there for new beginnings as well. And I think certainly we will probably see a growth of the middle ground, that kind of alliance thing, which is actually benefiting from hemorrhaging of support from the DUP, maybe middle class elements, and indeed from nationalist elements into that kind of middle ground as well. And as you said earlier, and it's undoubtedly true, it's that third swing constituency that was never there before. There was no alliance type party here between 1921 and 1971. It was very small, really, right up to very recent years. But that sort of middle ground is often fueled by young people with new ideas and so on. That is going to make a big difference. And of course, it also depends on how Brexit works out and whether we have the best of both worlds here, or Brexit turns out for these islands a catastrophe or a success.
Yeah, I mean, Eamon has said a lot there. And I mean, I think Brexit, a lot hinges on how that turns out, but then also the fallout from the pandemic as well. So one of the things I suppose that concerns me is obviously the huge impact that the pandemic has had on the disruption of people's lives, disruption to the economy, and the mental health issues. And we know that in Northern Ireland, we were already struggling with mental health issues. The mental illness rate in Northern Ireland is at 25% higher than the rest of the UK, even before the pandemic. And there's the whole issue of transgenerational trauma we haven't dealt with the past. So I think for the next 10 years, to be positive, progressive, or reconciled, we have to face those kind of mental health issues and dealing with the past issues head on, or else we'll become stuck again.
Yeah. And I know both Father Martin and Tim have to leave us very, very soon. So Tim, give us your best guess at where we might be in 10 years.
Well, I think if the last 10 years are categorized by the middle ground swelling by disaffected unionists, I think the next 10 years will be categorized by the middle ground being swollen by disaffected nationalists and Republicans. We already saw that a little bit in the European election, where people were transferring straight to Naomi Long. They weren't going SDLP, Sinn Féin. Naomi Long, they're going straight to that centre ground. And I think we'll see more nationalist Republicans, I think particularly west of the Ban, will be moving to that centre ground. So I think that's what we're going to see in the next 10 years. It will be the middle ground swelling even more. I think within unionism, I think we're going to see a kind of a struggle for identity. What is unionism going to look like? How is unionism going to change? There is a quite a large liberal unionist electorate, and they have nowhere to go at the moment. Are they going to be given a house to go to and vote for, and a party to vote for, or are they going to find their home in the centre ground in even greater numbers? So I think it's unionism's going to have to sort out where it's at, and I think nationalism, republicanism is going to have to cope with what unionism has had to cope with for the last 10 years, and that's a hemorrhaging away from their particular constitutional ideology.
Yeah, I'm glad Gladys mentioned the impact of the pandemic, and I think it is something that that we are really going to have to deal with, and I think it's going to really come to the fore. In terms of the wider issue, the whole question of the border poll is certainly not going to go away. It's going to be regularly in the media. It's going to be regularly talked about. And I suppose the whole question is how we can actually do that. Now, there have been some positive indicators that we can actually do that in quite a civilized way. But if it's not handled well, it could do a lot of damage. I'm going to go on the hopeful side that with the right sort of people involved in it, these sorts of discussions could actually could be held very respectfully.
Thank you very much, Father Martin Magill and Tim Cairns. Feel free to make your departure, because I know you've been both very generous with your time. I know you've got to go to other things, and I will just open it for a couple of minutes. If anybody has any other reframing question or asking for more information, feel free now to join us either on the screen or by typing your question in. This is great technology. I can see it all popping up as we go. Anybody want to put a question? We do have a question about, have you observed any changes or more awareness in the reporting from journalists on Northern Ireland, particularly in terms of the Scottish referendum issues, and whether that issue is connected, Eamon, to the continuing conversations here around identity and constitutional questions?
One thing that I've noted in the last sort of 2 or 3 years is basically that there's more coverage of Northern Ireland on network TV, which in the past, I mean, we were sort of a backwater unless something happened during the Troubles, or there was an agreement or a breakthrough, or it was the 12th of July, this place was never mentioned. Now it's being reported more and more, almost, it seems, as an integral part of the UK, something which I didn't notice before. Of course, that's reinforced by the fact that the South, as we often called it, the Republic is now more and more described officially as Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's something I've noticed as well. But I think that in terms of reporting, I think the fact that there is constitutional change in the air, the fact that the Scottish referendum is being campaigned avidly for the elections coming up, and I think that demographic change is expected here. I mean, nonetheless, I mean, that's the big thing. We have Jim O'Callaghan, who's the up-and-coming kind of star of Fianna Fáil, the traditional Republican Party in the Southern Irish system, Dáil Éireann. He is now talking about an agreed Ireland, a new country, which will always perhaps include unionism at its heart and government structures. I mean, that's something else we have to allow for, of course, that a messianic figure may emerge in the Republic who begins, as changes occur here, portraying a very different image of a very different vision of Ireland for the future.
And I think, I mean, we have to end now because we're way out of time. I think probably to summarize where we've come to in our conversation, it is the complexity means do not judge or understand the society of Northern Ireland, or indeed Ireland, simply through the lens of the politicians who get the airtime outside of Northern Ireland, and also understand that this place is not a settled place. It is a series of minority communities. It's a series of in-betweener communities. It's embryonic of change, and that change, we don't know what it's going to be, but it's bustling to get out there. So that would be our advice for your future reporting, probably. Thanks to all of you, Gladys Ganiel, Eamon Phoenix. Thanks also to Mark Magill and Tim Cairns, who had to leave us earlier.